Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we're going back to the past after focusing so much on modern politics and geopolitics from What If Altist. I'm going to go back and look at a World War II video from our friend, the Armchair Historian, one of his animated history videos. The topic of today's video is what happened to German soldiers after World War II? It's a good question. Obviously, there were millions of men that were displaced after the war. There were POWs in France, in Norway, in Belgium, in Denmark, obviously in the Soviet Union, and just millions of men that were all over the world, right? There were even German POWs in Canada. There were German POWs in the UK, in the United States. They were everywhere. And so it's a great question of, well, what happened to all these men? All these men that fought in the military and sacrificed everything they had. What happened to them? That was annoying. I had to get rid of that. So let's look into that. If you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe. We just passed 500 subscribers. Thank you all very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So now we can do little community posts and stuff like this so I can keep active with the YouTube audience. And if you haven't joined the Discord yet, that's the best way to keep active. Link is in the description below. This intro is too long. Let's get into it.
The German soldier's shovel pierces the soft loam. For the last year, he has worked on a farm in the southern United States, transferred to a labor detail after several months in a detention center. He and his fellows have spent their time laboring in the fields, watching American films, and thinking about what they'll do once the war is over. The Americans work their charges hard, but they are fed well and are treated better than the black sharecroppers who labor alongside them. Perhaps
That's really
our soldier
sad. That's really, really sad. You got to think about that. So free black men in the South are getting treated worse than German POWs that, yeah, I think that speaks for itself.
He will have a new trade to practice when he returns home. The German soldier's shovel strains against the frozen earth. For the last year, he has worked in a graveyard in the Soviet Union, transferred to a labor detail after several months in a detention center.
Yeah, hands down.
He and his fellows have spent their time shunting frozen corpses, languishing in Spartan barracks, and fighting desperately to survive. The Soviets work their charges hard, but the privations of war mean the communists can barely feed themselves, much less prisoners of war.
Yep.
Perhaps our soldier thinks he will soon join his former comrades who stare blankly at him from the pit.
That was really beautiful. That was really beautiful in a haunting way. So you have to think about the amount of millions of men that died on the Eastern Front. I won't get into it too much because I did a whole video on this, the fallen of World War II, but the tens of millions that perished on the Eastern Front and the millions that were captured too. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact statistic, but it was something like 75% of German POWs perished in the POW camps. It might have been closer to 80 or 90, but there's stories of whole battalions of hundreds of men becoming POWs and only a handful or a dozen returning. So it was really, really horrendous conditions that these men lived in.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. When VE Day was declared in 1945,
a nice shirt
the
instead.
Allied powers held roughly 11 million German soldiers as prisoners of war. The vast majority of these, close to 8 million, had been captured by the Western Allies, while the remaining 3 million were in the custody of the Soviet Union. With Europe liberated from Nazi aggression, the Allied powers were left with a critical question: what to do with their 11 million POWs? The issue was a divisive one, to say the least, as while the Western Allies were signatories to the Geneva Convention, which very clearly demanded the release of prisoners the moment the war ended, the Soviets had notably abstained from signing the international agreement.
Of course.
This meant that a captured German soldier's fate was ostensibly decided by whose hands they fell into. But war is a brutal business, and sometimes even international law is just ink on a piece of paper. In today's episode, we will examine the various ends a German soldier could meet after 1945, as well as the fates of some of Germany's war criminals.
Yeah, and so there was a great migrant flight during the final months of 1945 of civilians and soldiers trying to defect to the West so that they would be captured by the Western Allies, where they knew they would be treated better. Now, a lot of the treatment of Germans from the Soviet Union was obviously horrendous, but you have to remember too that there was a lot of propaganda that was instilled into the German people that also was a main reason for them to flee.
If you hadn't guessed already, war can be a stressful business.
And just to be clear too, that does not mean that no prisoners were mistreated by the Western Allies. Let me be very clear on that. It's not just everything bad was the Soviet Union. It's just arguably it was worse. Just want to be clear on that.
Soldiers on an extended tour of duty have to face many hardships, but there is one that rarely gets the consideration it deserves: male pattern baldness. Unfortunately for the soldiers of the Second World War, the internet wouldn't be invented for another 50 years, so they had no way to know about today's sponsor, Keeps. Keeps is a subscription service focused on making it easy for men seeking treatment for baldness online, with a variety of treatment options using affordable versions.
We're in a video about male prisoners of war, and they bring up male pattern. Oh my god, I love, like, this is one of my favorite parts of historical videos, is the way they put the ads in there. Oh, hilarious.
In February of 1945, the Big Three Allied leaders, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin, met at Levadia Palace in Crimea. This Yalta Conference was meant to decide the ultimate fate of a defeated Germany. A key point of the agreement among the three men was that their foe must be brought to heel and rendered unable to threaten the world for a third time. In addition to dividing Germany into occupation zones and the idea of monetary reparations, the Big Three agreed that the German people themselves must be made to physically repair the damage their nation had done to Europe.
So there was also some fascinating plans that was post the Yalta Conference of how to break up Germany. I did 2 videos on that. If you're interested in that, check the card in the top left that I will put up here. And if I forgot to do that, please let me know in the comments.
This included conscripting POWs for forced labor, a practice Stalin and his advisors thought necessary, and Roosevelt and Churchill regarded with tacit acceptance. But more on that later. During the war years, German soldiers were imprisoned in roughly 20 countries around the world, including in the continental United States. While stateside, many German prisoners were leased out to farms or factories to serve as laborers, providing additional hands to make up for the workers lost to the draft. A hotbed of this leasing activity was the southern US, where German POWs befriended American citizens and watched Hollywood films during their off hours. Overall, POWs sent to the US were treated humanely, and deaths of Germans in American custody were low at 491. Things were different in the internment camps in Europe, where American estimates for POWs who died in custody lie in the low thousands, while German tallies claim up to 40,000 fatalities in American custody. The Americans' early release of many prisoners complicates attaining an exact number. For their part, the British Empire managed the fate of up to 2.5 million German POWs by the war's end. Germans kept in Great Britain could be housed in anything from tents set up in a pastoral field to elegant manor houses repurposed as surprisingly posh prisons. Similar to their...
And there was also a big distinction between if you were an NCM or a non-commissioned member and if you were an officer. And the treatment difference between officers and NCMs, yeah, there must have been some serious resentment from NCMs. There's obviously always resentment from between NCMs and officers, even to this day. And in my experience as well, even though I'm just a Canadian reservist, but yeah, there is, you got to imagine if you're a POW and you're away from your family and you're not in the best conditions and you see the officers in the elegant mansions and whatnot, it's going to breed some resentment.
Comrades in the US, German POWs in Britain enjoyed a cordial relationship with British civilians who gave them money and foods that they were not usually fed. Germans in Britain could also be put onto a labor detail, for which they were paid a respectable 2 shillings per day of work. The number of German POWs who died in British custody was 1,254. British soldiers, as well as American, were also reported to have engaged in torture when interrogating Germans suspected of committing war crimes, often leading to confessions extracted under duress. But this was far from the worst a German captured on the Western Front could expect. That dubious dishonor lies with France. German soldiers captured during the liberation of France, as well as a number relocated there from American custody, faced abysmal conditions and vengeful civilians. French citizens would verbally harass or assault German prisoners, stoning or beating them, sometimes to death. Some POW camps seemed designed for extermination rather than detention. A French camp in the Sarthe gave its inmates only 900 calories worth of rations per day. For comparison, a Jew living in the early days of the Warsaw Ghetto was, on paper at least, allotted just over 1,000 calories of rations by the Nazis.
Yeah, I'm glad he said that on paper, because, yeah, as it points out here, this number was eventually reduced to 180 when the Nazis actively decided to starve their victims to death. Yeah, you have to think 180 calories. I mean, I just ate a wafer bar 2 minutes ago that I think 2 pieces of that wafer bar was 180 calories.
An average of 12 POWs died daily at the Sarthe camp, and shortly after VE Day, the Red Cross reported that almost 200,000 German soldiers in French custody faced imminent starvation. The United States was forced to halt any further shipments of POWs to France and mandate their adherence to the Geneva Convention, an act that, in practice, was largely symbolic. The end of the war meant, according to international law, repatriation. But for the Western Allies, the end of the war largely seemed to mean reparation. The US and Britain leased roughly 1 million German POWs to the French to rebuild their country, while 64,000 went to Belgium, 10,000 to the Netherlands, and 5,000 to Luxembourg.
So you'd have to think, too, the amount of resentment that the French people would have for the Germans that the Americans and the British didn't. So obviously the British had the Battle of Britain, and there was obviously air wars that were happening, and there were bombings and everything, but the French were directly occupied for years. And you know, you just sort of get that thought experiment in your head. If you were a French civilian, right, and you saw these men that a few months ago even might have been, you know, your sort of captors in a way, right, and now they're working for you, right, the kind of human psychology that triggers those power dynamics. So yeah, it's a really interesting thought experiment to sort of think of, well, how would you act, how would you feel, right? I hope he mentions the Nordics here, because I wanted to mention a fascinating movie called Land of Mine. I'm going to wait in case they bring it up, but in case they don't, go check out a movie called Land of Mine, one of the best films I've
on
seen
the
about
continent
this
would
topic.
assist in reconstruction, building roads or working in sawmills and quarries. Some in France and the Netherlands were made to clear minefields.
There you go.
2,000 POWs were killed or maimed each month doing this.
Yeah, so this was one of the worst jobs you could get, from what I understand, at least on the Western Front. So the film I talked about, Land of Mine, it's a small squad section, if you will, of boys, literal boys. I think the oldest one is maybe 17 or 16, and they were Hitler Youth, or oh my God, the word is escaping me. The final civilians that were called up to fight. The word's escaping me, but one of those. And they're tasked with clearing a Danish beach. And throughout the film, the boys sort of get friendly with the sergeant, Feldwebel, and obviously the story goes from there. And I won't spoil it, but amazing film. Go check it out if you have a chance. It is all in German, but there's plenty of you'll find English subtitles or any subtitles of your choice online. Fantastic film. Go check it out.
Conscripting the workers this way was a clear violation of the Geneva Convention, but the Western Allies claimed that since the German government technically did not exist, their charges were not prisoners of war, and therefore were not entitled to the protections afforded to POWs.
It's unfortunate, but yeah, here we go.
The Soviets had suffered greatly in their war against fascism, and they did not want a pound of flesh for their trouble. They wanted tons.
Yeah.
Soviet plans for post-war reconstruction included the use of German POWs as forced labor as early as 1944. Ivan Maisky, Soviet ambassador to the British Empire, called for the Germans to be given as reparations to the Soviet Union for a lengthy period, which he ultimately defined as 10 years. Maisky would refine his proposal for the Yalta Conference and provided Stalin with a full-scale plan to get the USSR a supply of 5 million German POWs to be used as forced labor for a decade after victory was achieved. With this mass conscription and the planned seizure of German land and wealth, the Soviets hoped they could keep the German people from ever fighting against the USSR again.
Wow.
With the war's end and the carving of Germany into occupation zones, the Soviet plans were put into effect. Soviet authorities began identifying their new charges, with ethnic Germans in Soviet territory investigated to determine if they had served in the war. Any who had verifiable Wehrmacht service were ordered to Soviet POW camps to be prepared for forced labor. The Soviets would organize their new workers into battalions of 3,000 to 5,000 men, divided into 1,000-man companies. They were primarily used for construction and heavy industry, with a laser focus on rebuilding the utterly devastated Soviet Union. 3 million Germans would be drafted into the Soviet labor companies. A full third would die there.
Third. My God.
It should be noted, however, that this may not have been the result of direct Soviet action or negligence. Theirs was a war of annihilation, where both German and Soviet gave no quarter and expected none. Consequently, a number of the men forced into these labor companies were POWs captured by the Soviets directly, and due to the horrible conditions of the Eastern Front, came into Soviet custody malnourished, sick, utterly exhausted, or some combination of the three. But it would not have been pragmatic for the Soviets to intentionally slaughter their newly acquired labor pool so shortly after a war that devastated their working population. From 1945 to 1946, many POWs who were too sick to work were simply released by the Soviets rather than be worked to death. A bad harvest and endemic corruption and mismanagement seemed to be behind the travails of German forced laborers in the early post-war years. However, as time wore on, the German laborers began to prove more trouble than their Soviet masters thought them worth. POW labor was a surprisingly expensive enterprise and had to constantly be subsidized by the main Soviet economy. The Germans contributed roughly 5% of the Soviet Union's total national income, a far cry from the grand reparation 5%. Envisioned by Maisky and his 10 years of servitude.
I heard that France's GDP, well, not that I heard, I read online, that France's GDP was roughly 2%. All right, so 5% in the Soviet Union and came from these German laborers, and 2% for France.
In a surprisingly capitalist move, Soviet industrial leaders began to see their German workers as unprofitable and began to skimp on their responsibilities to feed and care for them. After all, why waste good money and materiel on what they saw as fascist parasites? As their industrial managers began to sour on the concept, Soviet leaders began making moves toward repatriation. In 1947, the foreign ministers of the Allied powers agreed that they would repatriate all German POWs by 1948. The Soviet effort would last well into 1950, with roughly 26,000 German POWs who had been convicted of war crimes by Soviet courts not sent back to Germany as late as 1956. Overall, Germans in the Soviet Union after the war were faced with mandatory hard labor under challenging conditions, but the majority were repatriated long before the initial plan of 10 years.
And you just have to think too, if Germany had to push further, and they had have captured more Soviet troops, what would have happened to them? And I just think about the encirclement of the Sixth Army, of the German Sixth Army, and how many POWs that existed at that point, and how many of them actually made it home. If anyone and knows that statistic, let me know in the comments below. Oh, interesting. Those who escaped. Good question.
But what of Germany's soldiers who had been discharged before the war's end, or who had deserted their Führer's crusade against the rest of the world, or who simply had been far enough away from the front lines that they were not captured? Those Germans who escaped capture and who were in the Western occupation zones found themselves cast adrift in a new Germany. The Allies were keen to strip Germany of any martial will, and to this end, of militarism of any military-inclined organization or club. This meant that German veterans of the Second World War, unlike their former foes, had no support system to help them transition back into civilian life. These suddenly demobilized soldiers found themselves in a country gripped by denazification, as the Western Allies sought to purge the influence of Hitler and Goebbels' propaganda machine and eliminate all traces of Nazi ideology and warmongering. To this end, former soldiers were ordered to present themselves to Allied tribunals for summary judgment. Originally run by the occupying forces before being handed off to German authorities in 1946, these tribunals would take stock of the defendant's military and civilian activities during the war. The court would then categorize the defendant as a major offender, lesser offender, follower, or give them a full exoneration.
Yeah, and so denazification is a whole fascinating concept in and of itself, and I'd love to do a video on it. But there's actually some stories of people being reclassified depending on their actions, and bringing not really the government to court, if you will, but rather going to the courts to have their status changed. So if I remember correctly, I think it was Himmler's mistress, so the wife of his second child. I don't remember her name off the top of her head. Off the top of my head, off the top of her head. But she had her status changed, I think it was twice, maybe even 3 times, because she kept battling this this charge that she was, this status that she was charged with. And depending on the status that you had, meant that you could do certain things in post-war Germany. So for example, you would be stripped of your right to vote. You'd be stripped to work for any sort of public authority. So for example, if you wanted to even be an accountant for the government, you couldn't work. So obviously this would limit your labor capacity in the future.
By and large, rank-and-file members of the Wehrmacht were categorized as lesser offenders and sentenced to a 3-year period of probation. During this time, they were prohibited from holding public office or running their own businesses.
There you go.
As more and more defendants were found or presented themselves, the tribunal system began to buckle under an ever-growing caseload, and judges began finding or making a multitude of exceptions to speed the process up. Disabled veterans were often exempted from judgment, along with those who could prove that they were impoverished during the war years or were born after 1919. While this system succeeded in streamlining the process of former Wehrmacht personnel, it allowed those with real Nazi sympathies to slip through the cracks. Yep. Denazification was abandoned in the 1950s, as its inefficiencies became more apparent, and the German public began pushing back on the idea of individual culpability. Why reckon with your part in crimes against humanity when you can simply pin it all on a dead Austrian painter and move on with your life?
Nice. But I think there's an important point to make here, is that denazification, although obviously it did have its shortcomings, and those that were in more and more powerful positions generally got away with more things. So you have to look at something like Operation Paperclip. But it was overall successful, right? The intent of it was to basically quash the ideology in its place, was successful overall, right? This was, and there has been, to this day, no other sort of major fascist power or anything of the sort in the German government. And some people could point today and say the AfD, but I'm not going down that road. So That's one thing that I think is important to point out, though, is that denazification was generally successful.
In one of history's moments of irony, many former Wehrmacht personnel, judged by the Allies for their
Wehrmacht,
service,
not
would soon
Macht.
find themselves right back in uniform. With the growing threat of the
Yes.
Soviets to the east, the Allied powers realized that a militarized Germany would prove a keen ally should the world descend into another global conflict. The Bundeswehr was established in November of 1955, and many former Wehrmacht soldiers could be found in its ranks, sometimes wielding the same weapons they used to fight against the Allies.
Crazy, eh? And I believe, if I remember correctly, they also had the same helmet too, or they wore the American design. I can't remember, but the East German helmet. If you ever get a chance, if you look up the East German Army helmets, in East Germany, it's a pretty interesting design. This is something that I could also do a whole other video about, so let me know if you're interested in that in the comments below. And if you made it this far, thank you very much.
The war criminals of Nazi Germany, from the highest echelons of military and civilian leadership to rank-and-file guards.
So who do we have here? Let's see if I can name them all. Speer, Göring, Keitel. That looks like Ribbentrop. Not sure on those two.
Were arraigned on charges of crimes against humanity and prosecuted at a series of trials, most famously at Nuremberg. Prosecutors from all Allied nations presented a preponderance of evidence, ranging from private diaries to ledgers of concentration camps to military dispatches. The prosecution's point was clear. The military was equally responsible for Hitler's horrors as the SS and civilian leadership. There was no distinction to be drawn between the independent and politically minded SS and the duly enlisted soldiers of the Wehrmacht. While separate, these two cogs in Hitler's machine of annihilation would often work in
fantastic
sinister
visuals.
concert.
Amazing
The Wehrmacht would
visuals.
take an area, and the SS would purge it of undesirables. Military officers, such as Keitel, and high ministers, like Ribbentrop, were hanged,
Yeah,
while
there you go.
others were sentenced to prison terms, ranging from life to time served. Others, such as Hermann Göring, took their own lives rather than face the hangman.
That's a whole other story in and of itself. Fascinating story. There's a great video by Mark Felton on Göring's death. Very suspicious. Was probably smuggled in by an American guard, the cyanide. Really fascinating historical tale if you want to look more up.
There were even a few
Maybe I'll do a
female
video on that too.
defendants,
Let me know in
such
the
as the
comments.
sadistic hyena of Auschwitz, Irma Gräse.
Yeah. Oof.
Gräse was ultimately hanged for her brutal treatment of concentration camp inmates, unusual for a time when executing women was a stark rarity.
There was also a trial done in Poland. Yes, in Poland on one of the women's camps too, where I think it was something like 6 women were hung. Don't remember it off the top of my head, but yeah, there were definitely trials of women too. It wasn't Nuremberg, but it was a different type of trial.
But these people were still allowed a defense, and theirs was simple. We were just following orders. The thrust of these arguments was that any Nazi soldier, officer, official, or minister accused of crimes against humanity was simply following a directive from a higher authority. Some,
Nuremberg
in fact,
debunked
falsified
this.
orders to show that they had no choice in the matter, creating false paper trails to justify their own malice and cruelty toward Jews, Roma, LGBTQ people, and others the Nazi Party declared undesirable. Many of these false stories were pushed by the defendants' families who were tired of the war, tired of the reckoning, and just wanted their sons, daughters, husbands, or wives home, whether they were a monster or not. This attitude began to pervade German public consciousness with unfortunate results. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded, a new German state for a new German people. The first chancellor of this new Germany, Konrad Adenauer, opened his tenure by announcing plans for a general amnesty for war criminals who had been sentenced by the occupying powers.
Yeah, and so at this point, it's a fascinating discussion of whether this was the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do. But at this point, it became too unpractical to have basically most of your high-ranking civil authority to not be able to participate in post-war society. Now, this is a whole massive debate, and I think it's a really fascinating one. I'd like to read a little bit more on it before I talk about it. But yeah, practicality, utilitarianism, whatever you want to call it, outweighed the consequences for a lot of people that got away with some horrible crimes against humanity, in the rationale of, well, it's time for the Cold War.
The desire for Germany to be an ally against possible Soviet aggression trumped the desire for justice, and spring of 1950 saw the Advisory Board on Clemency for War Criminals established to review cases for leniency. 105 cases were brought to the Advisory Board in August of 1950 as family and friends of convicted war criminals, as well as representatives of the new German government, presented all manner of mitigating evidence, from medical history to the newly birthed clean Wehrmacht myth, which stated emphatically that all Nazi crimes were the fault of the SS and Hitler's inner circle. Proponents of the clean Wehrmacht myth argue to this day that the common soldier of Nazi Germany was an honorable, chivalrous man, fighting for home and hearth, untainted by the atrocities of his peers and the hateful rhetoric of his leaders. 84 of the 105 cases heard by the Advisory Board were dramatically lessened or outright commuted, and the fairy tale myth of the clean Wehrmacht spread through the German populace. Generations of Germans believed in a sharp divide between their ancestors who fought for Hitler and his crimes, eager to compartmentalize the shame of their nation's atrocities and their own family histories.
Right, and this was also spread by a lot of the generals that wrote post-war memoirs and directly contributed to the clean Wehrmacht myth. Right, one of them being Heinz Guderian. He wrote his memoirs, and he was sort of the proponent, one of the proponents of the clean Wehrmacht myth. Again, that's a whole other video I could make in and of itself. I could react to, whatever you want to call it.
War, like history, is never simple nor clean. The soldiers of Germany captured on the battlefield rightfully expected to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and in many cases they were, until the war's end. The pragmatic and vindictive moves by the Allies to force German POWs into rebuilding Europe do not excuse the crimes of Nazi Germany, just as Nazi atrocities do not excuse Allied violations of the Geneva Convention. It is imperative that we remember history is not entirely black and white, but rather painted shades of gray, with definite areas of clear morality and humanity. To simplify history into West versus East, good versus evil, or any dichotomy, is to ignore the true lessons our history has to teach us, and the most profound lessons are often to be learned in its darkest chapters.
Brilliant. I love this man. I love this man. That was fantastically said. Perfectly said. What a fantastic way to end the video here. What did you guys think? Perhaps you have a story that you would like to share with us of maybe one of your great-grandfathers or one of even your grandfathers might have been a German POW, knew someone that was a German POW, maybe their father was a POW, something along these lines. If you want to share it, be sure to do so in the comments, and I would love to have the discussion more on what happened and whether it was the right thing to do for sort of the Western Allies to put justice aside in what would you say, for practicality, if you will. Fascinating topic. Thank you guys if you made it this far in the video. I appreciate you very much. Awesome video from Armchair Historian. I'm definitely doing more. And yeah, that's all from me. So let me know what you guys thought in the comments. Take care, and I will see you guys in the next video.